Waiter insults Barron Trump for his clothes in restaurant, didn't know who his father was. James Mitchell dragged himself through the bustling kitchen of Le Bernardin, his starched collar already damp with sweat despite the evening having barely begun. The clinking of expensive china and the sizzle of perfectly seared fish filled the air, but all he could focus on was the dull ache in his feet, a constant reminder of another long night ahead. "Mitchell, table 7 needs their water refilled," barked Sophie, the senior waitress, who seemed to take special pleasure in ordering him around. "And for God's sake, fix your tie. This isn't some diner in Jersey." James caught his reflection in a polished serving tray. At 32, he looked closer to 40. Dark circles under his eyes told the story of late nights, picking up extra shifts, trying to make rent in a city that seemed determined to push him out. He straightened his tie with shaking hands, still jittery from his 4th cup of coffee. "Yes, Your Majesty," he muttered under his breath, grabbing the crystal water pitcher. 6 years of this job had slowly chipped away at his soul, each shift adding another layer of resentment toward the wealthy patrons who never seemed to notice him unless something went wrong. The main dining room was a symphony of quiet money, the kind of place where even the whispers seemed expensive. James weaved between tables, mechanically topping off water glasses while eavesdropping on conversations about summer homes in the Hamptons and private school admissions. "Did you hear about the Astor's divorce?" A woman in diamonds, worth more than his yearly salary, whispered to her companion. "Apparently, he's been keeping a second apartment in Dubai." James. Thomas, the maitre d', appeared at his elbow. "You've got a new table in your section. Solo diner, just seated." "Great," James sighed. "Another business type who'll run me ragged and leave 3%. He made his way to the newly occupied table, his rehearsed welcome speech dying on his lips as he took in the sight before him. A teenager, maybe 15 or 16, sat alone, fidgeting with his phone. The boy was tall and lanky, dressed in what James immediately recognized as decidedly casual clothes, a simple navy sweater and khaki pants that looked like they came from a department store. The boy's presence struck him as odd. Le Bernardin wasn't the kind of place where teenagers dined alone, and certainly not in clothes better suited for a mall food court. James felt a familiar surge of bitterness rise in his throat. Here he was, busting his ass in a monkey suit, while some kid wandered in looking like he was headed to a high school study session. "Good evening," James said, his voice carrying an edge he didn't bother to hide. "Can I help you find someone? Perhaps you're at the wrong restaurant?" The boy looked up, and James was struck by a flicker of recognition he couldn't quite place. There was something familiar about his features, but the waiter's growing irritation overshadowed his curiosity. "No, I have a reservation," the boy replied softly, his voice carrying a slight tremor. "I'm waiting for my mother. She's running a bit late." James raised an eyebrow, making no attempt to hide his skepticism. "A reservation? Under what name?" The teenager shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I'd rather not say, but I'm at the right place. My mom comes here often." "Listen," James said, leaning in slightly, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is Le Bernardin. We have a dress code. We typically expect our guests to show a certain level of respect for the establishment." At a nearby table, an elderly couple paused their conversation, the wife's fork hovering halfway to her mouth as she observed the increasingly tense interaction. "I understand," the boy responded, maintaining a composure that only served to irritate James further. "I apologize if my clothes aren't appropriate. I came straight from an appointment. My mother said it would be okay." James let out a derisive laugh that caught the attention of several more diners. "An appointment? At Foot Locker, perhaps?" He gestured to the boy's simple leather loafers. "This isn't the kind of place where you can just walk in off the street. Each plate here probably costs more than your entire outfit." The boy's face flushed red, but he remained surprisingly calm. "Sir, I understand your concern, but I assure you, I'm supposed to be here. Could you please just bring me some water while I wait?" Something about the kid's collected demeanor made James's blood boil. 6 years of serving the entitled children of New York's elite had taught him what to expect: tantrums, threats to call daddy's lawyer, demands to speak to the manager. This quiet dignity was somehow worse. "Water?" James repeated mockingly. "Maybe I can direct you to the drinking fountain at the McDonald's down the street." It might be more suitable for your current presentation." The elderly woman at the next table audibly gasped. Her husband half rose from his chair, but she placed a restraining hand on his arm. The teenager swallowed hard, his composure finally cracking slightly as his eyes began to shine with unshed tears. "Please," he said quietly. "I don't want any trouble. I'm just waiting for my mother." James opened his mouth to deliver another cutting remark when Thomas appeared beside him, a concerned look on his face. "Is everything all right here?" Before James could respond, the distinct sound of heels clicking on marble flooring echoed through the now hushed restaurant. James turned, ready to explain to what he assumed would be an overdressed socialite why her son couldn't be served. The words died in his throat. "Actually," the boy spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper, "maybe I should just go." He started to push his chair back, but James stepped forward, blocking his path. "That might be best," James sneered, feeling emboldened by what he perceived as victory. "There's a nice pizza place around the corner, much more your style." More diners were watching now. A woman in a red dress whispered something to her companion, shaking her head disapprovingly. At another table, a businessman had stopped cutting his steak, his fork suspended in midair as he observed the scene. "Is this how you treat all your guests?" called out the elderly man from the next table, his voice sharp with disapproval. "The boy has done nothing wrong." James turned to face the older man, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and self-righteousness. "Sir, we have standards here. This isn't—" "Standards of service?" interrupted the elderly woman, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she gestured. "Because from where I'm sitting, the only person bringing down the standards of this establishment is you." The teenager stood up, his height becoming more apparent. He was remarkably tall for his age, and something about his posture, the way he carried himself despite the humiliation, seemed oddly familiar to James. "Please," the boy said, addressing the elderly couple, "don't trouble yourselves. I'll leave." Thomas, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing concern, finally stepped forward. "Sir, perhaps I should handle this table." But James was too far gone, too invested in his moment of perceived power. 6 years of bowing and scraping before the wealthy elite had created a bitter well of resentment that had finally found an outlet in this seemingly misplaced teenager. "No, Thomas, I've got this," James said, his voice rising. "Let me explain something to you, kid. See all these people around you?" He gestured to the dining room. "They understand what it means to dine at a place like this. They respect the dress code, the atmosphere, the tradition. You can't just walk in here looking like you just left a public school cafeteria and expect, 'My son's clothing choices are none of your concern.'" The voice cut through the restaurant like a blade of ice. James's tirade died in his throat as he slowly turned toward the source of the voice, and in that moment, several things happened at once. The elderly woman covered her mouth with her hand. Thomas, the maitre d', took a quick step backward. And James felt the blood drain from his face as realization crashed over him like a wave of ice water. The clicking of heels had stopped, but James couldn't bring himself to look up just yet. He stared at the perfectly polished shoes, his eyes slowly traveling up to take in the elegant dress, the perfect posture, and finally, the face that had graced countless magazines and newspapers. The face of Melania Trump. The silence that fell over Le Bernardin was deafening. The soft clink of silverware had ceased, the murmur of conversations had died, and even the distant sounds from the kitchen seemed muted. James stood frozen, his mouth slightly open as the full weight of his actions began to descend upon him. Melania Trump's presence commanded the room, her perfectly tailored dress and elegant bearing making James's previous comments about appropriate attire seem even more ridiculous. Behind her, 2 Secret Service agents materialized, their earpieces and alert postures a stark reminder of exactly who this family was. James began, but no other words would come. "Mom," Barron said softly, "it's okay, we can go somewhere else." Melania raised one perfectly manicured hand, silencing her son without taking her eyes off James. "No, darling. We won't be going anywhere." Her accent, typically soft and measured, carried an edge that made several nearby diners shift uncomfortably in their seats. Thomas, the maitre d', rushed forward, his face ashen. Mrs. Trump, please accept our most sincere apologies. This is completely unacceptable, and I assure you. Thomas, Melania interrupted, finally breaking her steely gaze from James. You've known my son since he was 11 years old. How many times has he dined here? Thomas swallowed hard. Many times, Mrs. Trump. Barron has always been a perfect gentleman. And his attire? She continued, her voice carrying across the now silent restaurant. Has it ever been an issue before? Never, madam. Never in the slightest. The elderly couple who had tried to defend Barron earlier were watching the scene unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and sympathy. The woman leaned toward her husband and whispered, I knew that boy looked familiar. Those eyes. James felt sweat rolling down his back, his starched collar now feeling like it was choking him. His mind raced through every insulting comment he'd made, each one now playing back with horrifying clarity. He'd mocked the son of a former first lady, a teenager who, as he was now realizing, had shown remarkable restraint in the face of unprovoked cruelty. Mrs. Trump, he managed to croak. I had no idea. That's precisely the point, isn't it? Melania cut him off, her voice carrying a quiet intensity that was somehow more frightening than if she'd shouted. You had no idea who my son was, and yet you felt entitled to treat him with such disrespect. Would knowing his identity have changed your behavior? A murmur of agreement rippled through the restaurant. At a nearby table, a young woman was discreetly recording the scene on her phone, while her dining companion whispered, This is going to be everywhere by morning. One of the Secret Service agents took a small step forward, his presence alone making James take an involuntary step back. Barron, still standing by his chair, looked uncomfortable with all the attention. Mom, really, it's not a big deal. He tried again, his voice carrying a maturity beyond his years. He was just doing his job. No, sweetheart, Melania replied, her expression softening slightly as she looked at her son. This was not someone doing their job. This was someone choosing to be cruel to a teenager who was quietly waiting for his mother. She turned back to James, who felt like he might actually pass out. Do you know where my son was before coming here? James shook his head mutely. He was at the animal shelter, Melania continued, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed restaurant. Every Tuesday he volunteers there helping with injured dogs. He's been doing this for months, without any publicity, without anyone knowing who he is. He came straight here because I was running late with a meeting, and I told him not to worry about changing. The elderly woman who had defended Barron earlier dabbed at her eyes with her napkin. Her husband reached over and squeezed her hand. James tried again. I'm so sorry. I didn't. You didn't know. Melania finished for him. But that's not an excuse, is it? Whether my son is Barron Trump or any other young person, what gave you the right to humiliate him publicly? Thomas stepped forward again, his professional demeanor barely masking his distress. Mrs. Trump, please allow me to handle this situation. James, go to my office immediately. But Melania wasn't finished. No, Thomas, I would like to speak with the owner. She turned to look at the Secret Service agents. Is Eric here tonight? One of the agents nodded. Yes, ma'am. He's in the kitchen doing his routine check with the staff. Eric Rippert, Le Bernardin's world-renowned chef and owner, was known for his hands-on management style and regular interactions with his staff. James felt his knees go weak at the realization that one of the most respected figures in the culinary world was about to learn about his behavior. Mom, Barron said quietly, reaching out to touch his mother's arm. Can we please just have dinner? I'm actually pretty hungry. And he glanced around at the watching diners. Everyone staring. Something in her son's voice seemed to reach Melania, and her expression softened slightly. She looked at her son with a mixture of pride and protective fury. Pride at his composure and desire to defuse the situation. Fury at the fact that he'd been put in this position at all. Of course, darling, she said, switching to Slovenian for a moment as she spoke privately to her son. The tender exchange made James feel even worse, if that was possible. Thomas quickly pulled out Melania's chair, his movements carrying the precision of someone trying to salvage an impossibly broken situation. Mrs. Trump, please allow me to personally serve your table this evening. Our sommelier has just received a wonderful Slovenian wine that I think you'll particularly enjoy. That won't be necessary, Thomas, Melania replied, her accent becoming more pronounced with emotion. But I would still like to speak with Eric. And I believe you have someone who needs to be dealt with. James stood rooted to the spot, his career flashing before his eyes. 6 years of working his way up through New York's restaurant scene, finally landing a position at Le Bernardin, all destroyed in one moment of cruel pettiness. James, Thomas's voice cut through his panic. My office, now. As James turned to leave, he caught one last glimpse of Barron Trump. The teenager was sitting down, his mother taking the seat across from him, and despite everything that had just happened, there was no triumph or satisfaction in his expression. If anything, he looked sad. The elderly woman who had tried to defend him earlier caught his eye and gave him a gentle smile. Would you like to join us, dear? She asked warmly. We'd love to hear more about your work at the shelter. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson, Barron replied politely, and James realized with a start that the boy knew the regular patrons by name. Maybe next time. Mom and I have some catching up to do. As James walked toward Thomas's office on shaking legs, he could hear the gentle murmur of conversation resuming in the dining room. The sound of Melania Trump ordering in perfect French drifted after him, along with the quiet voice of her son asking about her meeting. The normalcy of their interaction, the simple mother-son moment that he had so thoroughly disrupted, hit James like a physical blow. He had no idea what was waiting for him in Thomas's office, but he knew with crushing certainty that he deserved whatever was coming. The last thing he heard before the office door closed behind him was Eric Reipert's accented voice greeting the Trumps warmly, followed by Barron's enthusiastic response about a new recipe he'd been wanting to try. The door clicked shut, and James was left alone with the knowledge that he had just committed career suicide in one of New York's most prestigious restaurants, all because he'd chosen to be cruel to a kind-hearted teenager who helped injured dogs on his Tuesday nights. James collapsed into one of the leather chairs in Thomas's office, his legs finally giving out. Through the thin walls, he could hear the muted sounds of the restaurant returning to its normal rhythm, though he imagined he could still feel the ripples of his catastrophic scene spreading through the dining room. A soft knock on the door made him jump. Thomas entered, his typically composed face now etched with disappointment and barely contained anger. 6 years, James, Thomas began, closing the door quietly behind him. 6 years you've worked here. Do you have any idea what you've done? James stared at his hands, which wouldn't stop shaking. I didn't know who he was. That's exactly the problem. Thomas's voice rose slightly before he caught himself. Whether he was Barron Trump or any other teenager, what possessed you to treat a guest that way? Any guest? The office felt suffocating. On the wall, James could see the framed reviews and accolades Le Bernardin had collected over the years. Each one seemed to mock him now. The Trumps have been coming here for years, Thomas continued, pacing the small space. Long before everything, Barron grew up eating here. That boy has always been unfailingly polite, modest, never once played on his name or status. Do you know how many celebrities' kids come through here acting entitled? But him. A light knock interrupted Thomas's lecture. Eric Rippert himself stood in the doorway, his chef's whites immaculate, despite having come from the kitchen. James felt his stomach drop even further. Thomas, Eric said quietly, his French accent more pronounced than usual. Mrs. Trump would like a word with me privately. Could you please ensure her table has everything they need? Thomas nodded quickly and left, leaving James alone with one of the most respected chefs in the world. Eric took the seat behind the desk, his calm demeanor somehow more terrifying than any angry outburst would have been. Tell me, James, Eric began, folding his hands on the desk. Why did you become a waiter? The question caught James off guard. He'd expected immediate termination, not a philosophical discussion about his career choices. I wanted to learn from the best, he stammered. To be part of something excellent. Excellence, Eric repeated thoughtfully. And what do you think makes a restaurant excellent? The food alone? The wine? The decor? James felt a tear slide down his cheek. No, chef. It's everything. The whole experience. The whole experience, Eric agreed. Including how we treat every single person who walks through that door. From the moment they arrive until the moment they leave, they should feel. He searched for the word, valued. Through the wall they could hear muted laughter from the dining room. Barron's voice carried faintly. He was apparently telling his mother about something that had happened at the animal shelter. That boy, Eric continued, gesturing toward the sound, has been coming here since he was small. Always quiet, always kind to the staff. Even during the hardest times, when his family was in the spotlight, he remained, how do you say, grounded. James wiped his eyes with his sleeve, not caring about decorum anymore. I've ruined everything, haven't I? You've certainly made a grave mistake, Eric agreed. But perhaps the more important question is, what have you learned? Before James could respond, there was another knock. One of the Secret Service agents stood in the doorway. Chef Riepert? Mrs. Trump is ready to speak with you now. Eric stood, straightening his chef's coat. Wait here, he instructed James. We're not finished. Left alone again, James could only sit and listen to the muffled sounds of the restaurant continuing without him. He thought about his apartment, with its past due rent notice. About his mother in Queens, who had been so proud when he'd gotten the job at Le Bernardin. About all the times he'd watched wealthy patrons snap their fingers at him, treat him like he was invisible, and how he'd just taken out years of accumulated bitterness on an innocent kid. The door opened again. This time, it was one of his fellow waiters, Michael. Thought you might want to know, Michael said, not unkindly. The kid's in there telling his mom not to make a big deal out of it. Says everyone has bad days and deserves a second chance. James put his head in his hands. He's defending me? Michael nodded. Yeah, though from the look on Mrs. Trump's face, I'm not sure it's going to help much. Man, James, of all the people to go off on. I know, James whispered. Believe me, I know. The next hour passed in a blur of anxiety and regret. Various people came and went from the office. Thomas checking on him, Michael bringing him water. Even the elderly couple stopping by on their way out to express their disappointment in his behavior, while also noting that, everyone makes mistakes, dear. Finally, Eric Riepert returned. His expression was unreadable. Mrs. Trump and her son have finished their dinner, he said, taking his seat again. They've left for the evening. Barron asked about you before they left. James looked up, surprised. He did? He wanted to make sure you wouldn't lose your job, Eric said quietly. He told his mother that you might have been having a bad day, that everyone deserves understanding. Fresh tears sprang to James's eyes. After how I treated him? Yes, Eric nodded. After how you treated him. That is the measure of that young man's character. The question now is, what is the measure of yours? The morning light, filtering through James's cramped apartment windows, felt harsh and unforgiving. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the termination papers in his hands, the events of the previous night playing on an endless loop in his mind. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn. First, it was his mother. Jimmy, I just saw something on the news. Please tell me that wasn't you they're talking about? Then his sister. James, what the hell? You're trending on Twitter. Someone posted a video. He'd turned the phone off after that, but not before seeing the headline starting to pop up on local news websites. Waiter fired after confrontation with former first son. Le Bernardin incident. Barron Trump shows grace under pressure. A knock on his door made him jump. For a moment, he considered not answering, but the knocking persisted. James, it's Michael from work. Well, from Le Bernardin. Can we talk? James dragged himself to the door, not bothering to change out of the t-shirt and sweatpants he'd been wearing since he got home last night. Michael stood there, still in his work clothes, looking uncomfortable. You look like hell, Michael said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Thanks, James muttered, closing the door. Shouldn't you be at work? Just finished the lunch shift. Michael looked around the small apartment, taking in the unpaid bills on the counter and the half-packed box in the corner. Are you moving? James sank into his worn armchair. Can't afford this place without the job, can I? Mom offered me her couch in Queens until I figure something out. Michael sat on the edge of the coffee table, leaning forward. Look, I thought you should know what happened after you left last night. James winced. Do I want to know? Probably not, but you need to hear it. Michael ran a hand through his hair. After you left, Mrs. Trump had a long conversation with Chef Riepert. But here's the thing. Barron kept interrupting, trying to defend you. Why would he do that? James whispered, more to himself than Michael. That's not even the craziest part, Michael continued. He told his mom about how he volunteers at that animal shelter every Tuesday. Apparently, there's this one dog there, Really aggressive, snaps at everyone who comes near. But Barron? The dog lets him get close. He told his mom that sometimes people are like that dog. They lash out because they're hurting, not because they're bad. James felt fresh tears welling up. He said that? About me? Yeah, he's a pretty special kid. Michael paused, pulling something from his pocket. Which makes this even harder to give you. He handed James an envelope. The paper was thick, expensive. The kind used for formal invitations or legal documents. James's name was written on the front in elegant handwriting. What is this? It came to the restaurant this morning, addressed to you. Mrs. Trump's assistant dropped it off. James stared at the envelope like it might bite him. Did she seem angry? The assistant? Actually, she seemed sad? She said something about Mrs. Trump wanting to handle this personally. With trembling fingers, James opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the Trump family letterhead at the top making his stomach clench. I can't read it, he said, holding it out to Michael. You do it. Michael took the letter, cleared his throat, and began to read. Dear Mr. Mitchell, last night, you made a choice that affected not only your career, but also demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of human dignity. My son, who you chose to publicly humiliate, spent his afternoon cleaning cages and comforting injured animals, work he does quietly and without recognition, because he believes in helping those who cannot help themselves. Your words and actions were cruel, but what troubles me more is that you felt entitled to treat any young person this way, regardless of who they were. This speaks to a darkness that has nothing to do with my son and everything to do with your own heart. I have spoken with Eric Rippert about your termination. This was not my decision but his, though I fully support it. However, Barron has asked me to share something with you. Michael paused in his reading, looking up at James with raised eyebrows. Man, she doesn't hold back, does she? Keep reading, James whispered, his voice hoarse. Michael cleared his throat and continued. However, Barron has asked me to share something with you. He believes, with a compassion that continues to humble me as his mother, that your actions came from a place of pain rather than genuine malice. While I'm not entirely convinced, I trust my son's judgment. Enclosed you will find two things. First, a letter from Barron himself, which he insisted on writing. Second, a gift certificate to Brooks Brothers. My son pointed out that if you struggled with the dress code at Le Bernardin, perhaps you could use some assistance building a professional wardrobe for your next position. This is not meant as an insult, but rather as my son's genuine attempt to help someone he believes is capable of better. The choice of what to do with these items, like the choice of how to treat others, is entirely yours. Regards, Melania Trump. James sat in stunned silence as Michael pulled out a second letter and a gift card from the envelope. The gift card amount made his eyes widen. Should I read the other one? Michael asked quietly. James nodded, unable to form words. Dear Mr. Mitchell, I hope you don't mind me writing to you. Mom thought it might be better to let the whole thing go, but I wanted you to know something. The dog I was telling her about at the shelter, his name is Max. When he first came in, everyone said he was too aggressive, that he couldn't be helped. But I spent time just sitting with him, not trying to force anything. Now he wags his tail when he sees me. I guess what I'm trying to say is that sometimes people are quick to judge without knowing the whole story. You judged me by my clothes, but maybe I judged you too quickly as well. Everyone has bad days. Everyone has things they're dealing with that others can't see. If you're ever feeling as angry as you were last night, the shelter could always use more volunteers. Max is still working on trusting people, and honestly, helping him has taught me more about patience and kindness than any fancy restaurant ever could. I forgive you, Mr. Mitchell. I hope you can forgive yourself too. Barron. P.S. The gift card was my idea. Mom wanted to send a lawyer. Michael folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. The silence in the apartment was deafening. James? Michael ventured after a long moment. You okay? A sob escaped James's throat. Not the quiet tears from before, but deep, body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere he'd kept locked away for years. All the bitterness, all the resentment, all the anger at serving people he thought had everything while he struggled to make rent. It all came pouring out. He forgave me, James managed between sobs. I treated him like garbage. And he wants to help me. Michael moved to the couch, putting a hand on his friend's shoulder. Yeah, he does. Question is, are you going to let him? James wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, looking at the letters again. What do you mean? Look, man, I've watched you get more and more bitter over the years. We all have. The way you treated that kid, that wasn't about him. That was about you. I know, James whispered. So maybe this is your wake-up call. Maybe instead of just feeling guilty, you could actually learn something from this kid who spends his free time helping angry, hurt dogs learn to trust again. The symbolism wasn't lost on James. He picked up the gift card, running his fingers over the embossed letters. I don't deserve this. That's kind of the point, isn't it? Michael stood up, heading for the door. Nobody deserves forgiveness. That's what makes it special when someone offers it anyway. After Michael left, James sat for a long time, reading and rereading both letters. Finally, he turned his phone back on, scrolling past the missed calls and messages until he found what he was looking for, the address of the animal shelter where Barron volunteered. It was still Tuesday. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to make a different choice. 2 weeks had passed since that fateful night at Le Bernardin. James stood outside the Manhattan Animal Care Center, his heart pounding as he checked the address on his phone one more time. He'd put this off for 14 days, the letters from Melania and Barron burning a hole in his conscience the entire time. Are you going in or just admiring the architecture? James turned to find an older woman in scrubs standing behind him, keys in hand. Her name tag read, Margaret, head veterinary nurse. James stammered, I'm here to volunteer? Margaret raised an eyebrow. That's funny, you don't sound too sure about that. No, I mean, yes, I am. It's just. He took a deep breath. Does Barron Trump still volunteer here? Margaret's expression changed instantly, her friendly demeanor turning protective. Why are you asking about Barron? I'm the waiter, James said quietly. From Le Bernardin, the one who… Ah, Margaret interrupted, recognition dawning on her face. The one who had the bad day. James blinked in surprise. That's how he described me? That's Barron for you, Margaret said, unlocking the front door. Come on in, he's already here, working with Max. The shelter smelled of disinfectant and dog food. Through a window, James could see rows of kennels, and the sound of barking echoed through the hallways. Margaret led him past the reception area to a smaller room at the back. Wait here, she instructed. Let me talk to him first. James nodded, his throat tight. Through the window in the door, he could see Barron sitting cross-legged on the floor of what appeared to be a training room. A large German Shepherd mix lay near him, not touching but watching intently as the teenager read from a book. Margaret entered the room, and James could hear their muffled conversation. Barron, honey? There's someone here to see you. Is it about Max? Did they find him a home? No, sweetie. Well, why don't you see for yourself? Barron looked up, and his eyes met James's through the window. There was a moment of surprise, but then, remarkably, a small smile appeared on his face. He said something to Margaret, who nodded and opened the door. Mr. Mitchell, Barron called out. Would you like to meet Max? James entered the room cautiously, noting how the dog's ears immediately flattened at his presence. He's still nervous around new people, Barron explained, keeping his voice soft and calm. But he's getting better. Aren't you, buddy? As if to demonstrate the opposite, Max let out a low growl. I got your letter, James blurted out, standing awkwardly by the door. Both letters, actually. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Barron replied, still focused on keeping Max calm. But since you're here, would you like to learn how to help? James looked at the growling dog, then at the teenager he'd humiliated, who was somehow offering him yet another chance he didn't deserve. I don't know anything about dogs, he admitted. That's okay, Barron said. Max is teaching me that sometimes the most important thing is just being there. Want to sit with us? Just move slowly, and don't make direct eye contact with him yet. For the next hour, James sat on the floor of the training room, listening as Barron explained how he'd been working with Max for months. The dog gradually stopped growling, though he kept a wary eye on the newcomer. He was found tied up behind an abandoned building, Barron explained. The police think he was used for fighting. When he first came in, he wouldn't let anyone near him. Would you believe he bit through a metal cage? James watched as Max inched slightly closer to Barron, clearly seeking reassurance about the stranger in his space. "How did you get him to trust you?" James asked. "I didn't, at first," Barron admitted. "I just sat here, reading my books, doing my homework, ignored him completely. Sometimes when people or animals are hurt, trying to force them to trust you just makes it worse." The wisdom in those words, coming from someone so young, hit James hard. "Like at the restaurant," he said quietly. "You could have gotten angry, called security, made a scene, but you didn't." "Getting angry back never helps," Barron replied, reaching out slowly to scratch behind Max's ears. "Mom wanted to press charges, you know, said it would send a message." James felt his stomach drop. "Why didn't she?" "Because I asked her not to. I told her about Max, about how he's teaching me that sometimes the scariest dogs are just the ones who've been hurt the most." Max had relaxed enough to lay down again, though he kept himself positioned between Barron and James. "He's protecting you," James observed. "Yeah," Barron smiled. "Ironic, right? Everyone said he was too dangerous, but now he's the protective one. People can surprise you if you give them the chance." Margaret appeared in the doorway. "Barron, honey, your security detail says it's time to go." "Already?" Barron looked at his watch. "Time flies when you're making friends, right, Max?" The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. "Same time next week?" Margaret asked, then looked at James. "Both of you?" James glanced at Barron, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd like that," James said, "if it's okay with everyone." "Max gets to vote too," Barron said with a small laugh. "But I think he'll come around. He's got a good heart under all that fear. Most beings do, don't they?" As they walked out to where the Secret Service agents were waiting, James finally found the courage to say what he'd been holding in. "Barron, I am so sorry. Not just for what I did, but for who I was that night. You didn't deserve any of it." "I know," Barron replied simply. "But you're here now. That's what matters." He paused by the car, then added, "Oh, and Mr. Mitchell? Next time you come, wear clothes you don't mind getting dirty. Max is still working on his manners." James watched as the black SUV pulled away, then looked down at the volunteer application Margaret had given him. At the bottom, there was a handwritten note. "Everyone deserves a second chance, even the scared ones, E.B." That night, back in his apartment, James finally opened the gift card envelope that had been sitting on his counter for 2 weeks. Tomorrow, he'd go get some new clothes, not for a fancy restaurant job, but for sitting on the floor of an animal shelter, learning about forgiveness from a teenager and a scared dog with a good heart. Sometimes, he realized, the best lessons in life come from the people and animals you least expect to be your teachers. The following weeks fell into a steady rhythm. Every Tuesday, James would arrive at the shelter, now wearing comfortable clothes suited for dog handling. Max gradually began to accept his presence, though progress was measured in tiny increments: a slightly less tense posture, a briefer growl, an occasional glance that held curiosity instead of fear. One particularly memorable Tuesday, about a month after his first visit, James arrived to find Barron already in the training room, but this time he wasn't alone. "Mom wanted to see what I've been up to every week," Barron explained as Melania Trump, dressed surprisingly casually in designer jeans and a simple blouse, sat on one of the plastic chairs against the wall. James froze in the doorway, his throat suddenly dry. This was the first time he'd seen her since that night at Le Bernardin. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her accent carrying that same careful precision he remembered. "Please come in. Barron has been telling me about Max's progress." "Mrs. Trump, James began, but she held up a hand. "I am here as a mother, watching her son do something he believes in," she said simply. "Nothing more." Max, who had been lying near Barron, raised his head at the tension in the room. James noticed how the dog's eyes moved between them all, assessing, just as he'd done that first day. "See, Max?" Barron said softly, scratching the dog's ears. "Everyone's a little nervous sometimes. It's okay." Melania watched her son with the dog, her expression softening. "He has always been like this," she said, almost to herself. "Finding the good in difficult situations." James took his usual spot on the floor, maintaining the distance from Max that they'd established over the weeks. "He's taught me a lot," he admitted. "Both of them have." "Tell her about last week," Barron encouraged, a hint of pride in his voice. "Max took a treat from my hand," James said, unable to keep the smile from his face. Through the fence, but still, a month ago he wouldn't even look at food if I was in the room. Small steps, Melania observed. In dogs and in people, yes? The meaning behind her words wasn't lost on James. Before he could respond, Margaret poked her head into the room. Sorry to interrupt, but we've got a potential adopter here to meet Max. The change in the room was instant. Barron's face fell slightly, though he tried to hide it. Max, sensing the shift in energy, pressed closer to the teenager. Already? Barron asked, his voice small. But he's not. I mean, he still needs. That's usually how it works, honey, Margaret said gently. When they're ready, they find their person. The potential adopter, a middle-aged woman named Susan, entered the room cautiously. She had kind eyes and moved with the careful awareness of someone who understood anxious dogs. Hi, Max, she said softly, not moving closer, just settling onto the floor near the door. I heard you're quite the special boy. To everyone's surprise, Max didn't growl. He watched her intently, still pressed against Barron, but his tail gave a single tentative wag. He likes you, Barron said. And James could hear the mix of joy and sadness in his voice. You've done amazing work with him, Susan said, looking at Barron with genuine admiration. The shelter told me how far he's come. He did the work, Barron replied, gently stroking Max's fur. We just gave him the chance. James watched as Max gradually relaxed, even taking a few steps toward Susan when she offered a treat. The dog looked back at Barron, as if asking permission, and the teenager nodded encouragingly. It's okay, buddy, he whispered. Sometimes, good things are scary at first. Melania reached over and squeezed her son's shoulder, understanding the moment for what it was. Not just a dog meeting a potential new owner, but a lesson in letting go, in trusting that sometimes the hardest changes are the ones we need most. As they all watched Max cautiously accept another treat from Susan, James realized something profound. A chain of forgiveness and second chances had brought them all to this moment. Barron forgiving him, Max learning to trust again, and now Barron himself learning to let go so Max could have the home he deserved. You'll visit him, right? Barron asked Susan, his voice catching slightly. Of course, she smiled. And you know what? I work from home right around the corner. Maybe Max would like it if his favorite trainer stopped by sometimes. The smile that lit up Barron's face was worth everything. James caught Melania wiping a tear from her eye, though she quickly composed herself. Later, as they were leaving the shelter, Barron turned to James. See you next Tuesday? There's a new dog coming in. They say she's even more scared than Max was. James looked at Melania, who gave him a small nod. I'll be here, he promised. After all, everyone deserves a chance to learn how to trust again. As he watched the Trump's car pull away, James touched the Brooks Brothers gift card in his pocket, still unused. Maybe it was time to put it to use, not for a restaurant uniform, but for something more meaningful. After all, he had a feeling he'd be spending a lot more Tuesdays on the floor of this shelter, learning about second chances from some remarkable teachers.